Scott, I've got to tell you, I was just telling these guys that your tweet when you were asked, how do you feel about Beth Moore and John MacArthur? And you just said, I love Beth Moore, was the most gangster reply to a tweet I've ever seen in my life.
I didn't even mean it to be funny.
It was hilarious.
I thought, why is someone asking me this? I thought, I love Beth Moore. And then I got criticism for not loving John MacArthur. And I thought, oh, brother.
Well, Scot McKnight, welcome back to A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Yeah, great to be with you guys again.
Yeah, I think tonight, Scott, you are setting the record. You're breaking your tie with Beth Ellison Barr for most appearances on the podcast.
Oh, how about that?
I'm pretty sure.
Really?
This is the fourth time. So
I'm gonna have to write her, let her know.
Absolutely.
You're winning.
So you wrote this book about Revelation. I don't know how long in the making this book was, Scott, but can you tell us where the book came from? Why you wanted to write it?
How long did it take to write? I'm 69 years old. So it probably took at least 55 of those years. Okay. I grew up in dispensationalism, and the first Bible that I bought with my paper route money, I was about 13, 12 or 13, was a Schofield Bible, reference Bible, the old one, you know?
Yeah.
And Morocco leather. My dad said it was a nicer Bible than he had. And I learned a little bit of dispensationalism from the notes in that Bible. None of my pastors were big on the Schofield Bible, but it was the Bible of preference in our church. When I was in high school, though, I encountered Salem Kurban, who most people do not know, Salem Kurban, but he was before Hal Lindsey, writing the same kind of stuff that Hal Lindsey wrote. And some people think Hal Lindsey got his ideas from Salem Kurban. He wrote a book called 666. And then I read A Guide to Survival, which was written for people who survived the rapture and were left on earth, and this would guide them through the tribulation. In college, I read Robert Gundry's book that convinced me of a post-trib rapture. And at that point, I was semi-connected with being a liberal for being post-trib. And then it was a big issue in college, all the eschatology stuff. And then I went to seminary, and that stuff just sort of disappeared from me. I got interested in other topics. Really did not get much interested in that until I was teaching in seminary at Trinity, and I taught on the Gospel of Matthew 24, and I realized then that I was somewhat of a preterist, trying to teach that Matthew 24 was about 70 AD. I'd read Josephus, the Jewish War, and it just all seemed so first century to me. But I did not teach much about eschatology. When I taught college students, it just never came up all that much. I never taught the book of Revelation. I did give a lecture or two at times in survey courses, but then I've read it. I've read about it. I've always been interested a little bit in it. I read Jewish apocalyptic literature, and I was ready just to all of a sudden say, I want to do this. A D-Min student, a doctoral student of mine, said in class one day, would you teach in our next course the book of Revelation? And I thought, I'd really like to do that, but there's no way in my schedule that I can do that for the next class. So a couple years later, I saw what was happening in my schedule, and I said, it's time. So I began to work on the book of Revelation. I'd read several books recently that really got me interested in it again. And I taught it with Cody Matchett, was my graduate assistant. And I told Cody when we were preparing lectures and when I was working on it, I said, when this class finishes, I'm going to start writing a book on this. I'm going to see if it works. And if it does, I want you to be the co-author. And in December, I was already writing pages. So that's sort of my interest. I became convinced a long time ago that dispensationalism, as classically known in the speculation type approach, is a serious misreading of the book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean just it's a preference. I mean, it's wrong.
Yeah.
That's not what this book is doing.
So let's go
And
into
so,
that a little
yeah.
bit. That was literally my next question on the outline, because we've avoided talking directly about dispensationalism on the show so far. It's come up tangentially every now and then. So this is a good opportunity to actually say what's wrong with it. So can you just set up for our listeners who may not be familiar with it, what it is, how they read Revelation, why they read it that way, and what do you think the major...
Yeah. There's a lot of things going on in dispensationalism. It's almost like an entire systematic theology and an entire way to read the Bible. So it's a big set of it's as big as Calvinism in that sense. It's as big as any kind of theological agenda. But first of all, it teaches people to read the Bible in a pattern of 7 stages. I could never remember the stages. I haven't thought about them since I was in college, where I had to write it down on a test. So there are like 7 stages. Of course, the last is eternity, the kingdom of God, etc. No, it wouldn't be kingdom of God. But the characteristics of dispensationalists are sort of a major emphasis on the rapture of Christians from planet Earth, where they will suddenly go up into the sky, skyriders, and whatever they're doing, Jesus will return, and if they're driving a car, their car will go careening into other cars. If they're typing on a machine, the typing will stop. If they're riding a bicycle, the bicycle, whatever they're doing, it's going to end. And they'll all be lifted into the sky to be with Jesus. And then there will be a 7-year tribulation on earth where things will just get impossibly difficult, and God will breathe out his wrath and convince Israel. Now, see, the rapture is of the church. The tribulation prepares people for the millennium, and the millennium is for Jews who believe in Jesus. And at the end of the millennium, there's judgment and everything. Then everything turns into the New Jerusalem and eternity. Those are sort of the big pictures of dispensationalism. And it teaches people to read the book of Revelation as let's say, minute predictions of what will happen on planet Earth in graphic detail, so that the readers become speculators, I like to call them. They people who interpret it, their preoccupation tends to be who in the modern world, Vladimir Putin, corresponds to which character in the book of Revelation, i.e., the beast from the land, the beast from the sea. And so there's always been a preoccupation with identifying countries: Russia, Nazi Germany, China. I was interviewing with someone the other day trying to convince me, here he's got me talking about this book. He's trying to convince me that China is predicted in the book of Revelation. I go, oh boy, I don't know what I'm going to do here.
Oh man, you end on the Zoom button.
It was on a radio station, so it got to be interrupted every now and then. But that's the sort of thing with dispensations. But what I began to realize in the 80s was everything that I was taught in the 60s and 70s, every prediction that anybody made was wrong.
Yes.
And I thought, at some point, we're just going to say, this is not the way to read the book of Revelation. But
you would think,
who knew? Isn't that what they say? Who knew that all of a sudden then we'll just start finding more and more people? It'll just keep going and going and going. And now John Hagee, down there in Texas somewhere, he's predicting all these things again. And a lot of them believe that in 1948, Israel became a nation as a fulfillment of the fig tree in Matthew 24. They believe the temple will eventually be rebuilt. and that there will actually be sacrifices on the temple again. So that's pretty literal reading.
Yeah. I mean, I say this more seriously than snarkily, but it resembles astrology more than theology to me. So
just as long as people don't quote me saying that.
All right, that's me. That's Randy.
You can just nod along. It's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
It won't be attributed to you.
This isn't in the outline, Scott, but this would be helpful, I think, for our listeners. So we get the translation of the Revelation of Saint John, but really the book is called the Apocalypse of Saint John, and it's Book of Revelation is one of the few apocalyptic books in the Bible. Can you just tell our listeners what is apocalyptic writing? Why is Revelation like the way it is?
Apocalyptic writing is a let's say a personal, almost autobiographical narrative of journeying usually to heaven or encountering angels, during which time God reveals to the apocalyptist that what is about to take place, and the revelations are in graphic, bizarre images, dragons and stuff like this. Pretty cool. Angels zooming and zipping everywhere. And it becomes then a powerful vision of the establishment of justice, the rectification, as it were, of God's ways on earth.
Come on.
One of the driving questions of an apocalypse is, why does God allow bad things in the world to happen? Mm-hmm. And also, why do the people of God suffer so? And this, an apocalypse reveals what's going to happen. And it's always going to happen that the bad guys lose and the good guys win. And the good guys are always our team, the people that we believe to be true. So, and then it motivates people to live according to the ethic that is taught in the apocalypse, or that is assumed in the Christian circles of a Christian apocalypse, or a covenant life, Torah life in a Jewish apocalypse.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I think it might be helpful to listeners to zoom out a little bit and become a little bit aware of some of the interpretive alternatives to the Book of Revelation that scholars have taken over the years. So you mentioned preterism a few minutes ago, and you, at the beginning of the book, give a kind of a quick overview of the four main options for interpretive frameworks that are commonly applied to Revelation. So I'm hoping maybe you can just give a quick overview of those and maybe say what you think the strengths and weaknesses of each are, and maybe where you land.
Preterism, most of these categories tend to be almost entirely shaped by time. When are these things going to happen? So it tends to get stilted in the direction of prophecy, predictions. The preterists think that everything has happened, that right now, when we look back, everything in the book of Revelation was about the first century. Mm-hmm. So a lot of preterists will date the book before the destruction of Jerusalem in the 60s. Pretty hard to prove, I think. And when you need that for your interpretation to be true, you're skating on very thin ice in warm weather. So to me, and I think that the book itself is addressed to a first century set of churches, 7 churches, and it was about them, but it is making use of something that I would call timeless. And so that's the preterists. It's about the first century, and it's all over in the first century. The historicists, I don't know why they're called this. I think people didn't have a good term for it. I heard this when I was in college the first time, and it just seemed hokey to me. So the weakness of this one is that it's hokey. All right. It looks at each of the 7 churches as a distinct period of the church. Mm-hmm. So the first church, Ephesus, let's say, is the first century, and then Laodicea is at the end, and it's the one we're almost into, And I remember hearing people say, we're in the Philadelphia church, and we're on the edge of entering into the final days. So that's the historicist view. It's sort of a sliding picture of the history of the church in these different churches.
That is
the
odd.
Weakness of this is everyone who's done this has almost always predicted that they're on the verge of the last group, and they've been wrong every
Nobody's
time.
ever thought we're at like 2 or 3.
Yeah, nobody thought we were that early. No. The other thing is, it's the breaking up of the churches has been so weak in understanding those periods in church history that it just cannot. This view, I don't think, is held by hardly anyone these days. That I didn't read anybody recently that believes this. The third view is futurist, and this, I think, is characteristic of the dispensational view in some ways, is that everything is in the future. So even if you take the 7 churches as first century, from Revelation 4 on, it's all about the future. And that future is still future to us, or at least it's on the edge of fulfillment. And that tends to be the people who really get into the book of Revelation as prediction. Now, the final view is idealist. And I think this term was created for people that they didn't like, but the time people didn't like. And so they say it's just a set of ideas and images that are, let's say, large stereotypes of periods in the church. Judgment is always occurring. There's the New Jerusalem is heaven, etc. And there's no real predictive power to it. In my view, the skewing of types of interpretation to time distorts the message of the book. So I'm with, I don't know exactly how Michael Gorman describes himself. I don't remember if he identified himself in one of these. But I would call what Cody Matchett and I did in this book a theopolitical reading of the book of Revelation. It's about understanding politics, the powers of this world in terms of how God sees them, and leading to a form of the Christian life that is consistent with the way of the Lamb. So I think people will call me an idealist. I got into it this weekend with some guy, and not in an argument, but he started saying something. I said, my view is pretty close to preterism in thinking that it's about the first century. Well, he said, I wouldn't have thought that. But he had a very kind of strange view of preterism. I think that the book is about the first century, but it conveys a theopolitical hermeneutic that becomes significant for us over time, so that the book of Revelation is timeless as well. So a sort of combination of preterism and idealism that I want to call a theopolitical reading of the book of Revelation.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. How long would you say that theopolitical interpretation or lens of seeing Revelation has been around, that you share with Michael Gorman and Roland and Bauckham and, a lot of you in that space? Is that a new kind of lens, or has it been around forever?
There's a lot of weird interpretations of book of Revelation. The speculation approach has been, I would say, the dominant approach. But it's a 20th century apocalyptic. Once apocalyptic literature became more common and people began to read it, more and more people began to make the connections that the book of Revelation is mostly a timeless set of images that discern the politics of empire and give us categories for discerning empire.
Mm-hmm. And this is just a side question that I'm interested in. How much did you have to study the book of Daniel in order to understand the book of Revelation?
Well, yes. I mean, there are things in Daniel that show up in the book of Revelation, right. But I'm nervous about thinking that John sees what he's writing as the fulfillment of what was predicted in the book of Daniel.
He's borrowing
Daniel's a
imagery,
part,
right?
yeah. It's what?
He's borrowing imagery.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. John, I tell my students that when John saw something, I don't know that he saw some thing right here, but like he was dreaming or in his head. So it's a visionary experience, but I don't know that it would be a palpable material thing apart from his body.
Mm-hmm.
And when John saw those things, he had to use words to describe them. And the words that John had are just like someone who was so soaked in books like Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, so soaked in those books and Jewish apocalyptic literature and some Greco-Roman stuff, so soaked in that when he described it, he used language from those texts.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean he thinks this is a fulfillment of a prediction.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the way he did it. And here's the way I would describe it. I grew up in a Baptist church where we all read the King James Version of the Bible. And I can remember, and I learned to do this, I can remember older people who could virtually carry on conversations in Elizabethan or Shakespearean English because they were so familiar with the Bible. We all prayed in the King James English.
Yeah.
And I remember dating my girlfriend in high school, who's now my wife, that when she prayed, she used common English. And it was weird. I thought, no, people don't talk like that when they pray. They're supposed to use King James. But we could talk in the King James English, and I could read the King James Bible. I still can read the King James Bible very easily because of all the familiarity I had with that Bible. My father died just a few years ago, 91 years old, and he still prayed in the King James. He when he turned to prayer, it was always King James English, hath and doth and all those sorts of words. So that's what John does. He reverts to biblical language when he describes it, and he expects people to pick up those resonances at times. And some people think there are some 300 echoes of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, others up to 600. What's amazing is John almost never quotes the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
So his mind is so filled with those visions of the Old Testament that's how he describes it. Doesn't know any other way.
Super helpful.
So a recurring theme in the book is that the audience of Revelation is what you call dissidents or dissident disciples. So can you describe for our listeners what that is and how it's relevant to us trying to read Revelation today?
Very simple. These are skinny jeans people. It's all you need to know.
Say more.
Okay.
Man, write about that.
All right. Revelation chapter 17 through 19 is the secret to reading the book of Revelation. Revelation 17 to 19 describes Babylon. It's Rome, city of seven hills, the great city. But it is Babylon because Babylon is language of the Old Testament for tyranny, empires, oppressors, dominating empires that oppress the people of God. And the book of Revelation castigates Babylon with strong, vivid image of destruction and defeat, and glorying by the merchants of the earth who are thrilled to see Rome lose its power because now they get to have their merchandise back and all the cargo that they've been shipping to Rome and not making much money on. The book of Revelation then is teaching the readers of the book of Revelation that Babylon, Rome, is going down. It's going to fall. And it gives the people who read the book categories for understanding the moral failure and the bad things, the bad marks of Babylon. And in that whole sweep of understanding Babylon, suddenly the believers of Western Asia Minor understand what's wrong with political powers. And all of a sudden, we gain a hermeneutic for understanding the characteristics of empire and political corruption. And that's the people who believe that, who live that, become people who resist and become dissidents of Babylon. And one of the most important teachings of the book of Revelation is that believers in Western Asia Minor are taught to resist what I call Babylon creep, Babylon getting its way into the church and into society, and having the categories to recognize when it's present. Dissident.
Yeah.
Perfect.
And I think at the beginning of the book, you dedicate it to Beth Allison Barr and Kristen Kobus Dumais, and you describe them both as modern dissidents, right?
Christian dissidents. That's right.
Yeah.
It was really fun to write that. I thought this is going to be fun, and I'll get some of those wags criticizing me
Oh yeah.
or dedicating it to, and I thought, well, let them do it. I think that they're perfect examples of people with keen eyes to discern the presence of corruption. Both Kristen and Beth see things and they go, that's wrong. And they're not afraid to say it.
No.
And that's a dissident. That's a Christian dissident.
And it drives the Theo bros nuts. Why don't you ask your question about Babylon as a follow-up?
Yeah. So you say in the book, if I recall correctly, that the use of Babylon in that way is not unique to Revelation at all, that it's kind of a trope, actually, in ancient Jewish literature. So can you explain that larger context and what's going on there with Babylon? It's not, Babylon hadn't existed for a long time by the time Revelation was written. So what's going on?
Yeah, Babylon is in Jeremiah, is in Isaiah. It's a city where Jews were exiled to, and they experienced exile from their country and a longing to return, and they got to return in 516 BC. But in Jewish literature, from that point on, well, give it a few hundred years, Babylon started to become like antedum to an American historian about Civil War, or to Vietnam for someone of my age, or D-Day.
Yeah.
It became an image of it evoked a time, it evoked an event, it evoked judgment, it evoked the opportunity to return to the land. So Babylon becomes an image, and we have, even in the first century, Jewish texts that are apocalyptic calling the city of Rome Babylon, and identifying Nero himself in the text as an embodiment of someone who lives in Rome and corrupts the people of God. And of course, Nero burns the city down, blames a Christian, and Claudius had already kicked out the Jews at one point. They returned under Nero, but then everything turned again. Nero was, of the bad emperors in the first 100 years, Nero ranks right up there at the top of idiots in the world. It's really, his Suetonius's biography of Nero is just description of a disgusting human being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in chapter 3, Scott, this fascinating chapter talking about engaging our imaginations as we engage with the book of Revelation. Mm-hmm. And you even said the book of Revelation should be read more like the Lord of the Rings, more than Paul's letter to the Roman church, for instance. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about how the apocalypse, how the book of Revelation would have been presented to the original churches, and how that might influence the way we engage with the book of Revelation?
Well, this is a good way to get yourself in trouble if you're a pastor at a church and you're preaching. But what happens to the book of Revelation, the visions of chapters 6 through 16, including then and adding the Babylon pictures of 17 through 19? What happens if you say to readers, this is fiction? What happens to their reading? I'm close to saying that. Mm-hmm. I do think that it's fiction, not in the sense of Hemingway or Fitzgerald, or I'm reading Francois Mauriac, some of his novels right now, where they're just completely making up an entire world. There's something about this literature that is telling truth, that is realer than the real, that sort of thing. But it is, I tell my students, I tell people who will listen to me, The way children respond to Morris Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, the way we respond to the Chronicles of Narnia, the way we respond to Lord of the Rings. I have not read a word in Harry Potter. So whatever is going on in Harry Potter, I'm told that it's very much like this, is that it's fiction in the sense that we are called to enter into the story. Now, to enter into the story of any kind of fiction requires imagination on the part of the reader, because that's what the author wants you to do. The author wants you to leave your world and enter into this narrative fiction this narrative world that the author has created, and to live in that environment. And then when you put the book down, you enter back into your world in some way impacted, the way the Pevensie children have been into Narnia and they get popped back out of the threshold, the wardrobe, back into the old house. And all of a sudden they're back to reality and things aren't as cool as it was in Narnia. That's what I think the book of Revelation is designed to do. And if you realize that this book was read aloud, in fact, experts in the ancient world of reading performance would even say that the reader, the so-called lector in Latin, would probably have had the whole book memorized and would have read it or performed it 7 different times for each of the 7 churches. And every time that the author or whoever, the lector, performed it, the lector would have looked at the audience and adjusted what he was or she was saying in accordance with the author, the audience responding to it. So it's a small house church. They're listening to this and they're just stunned because they are very capable of listening to someone read a story and go right where that author wants them to go. And they got all these questions. They're raising their hands, or they're shaking their head, or they're giving a sign on their eyes that they don't quite understand. And the lector would have seen that and extemporaneously clarified what was being said. So I remember when I was a young boy, my mom and dad took me to the library at times on Saturday morning, and that's when I didn't have baseball games or something to do, because they just wanted to get me out of the house. And our librarian's name was Mrs. Pop. And she would read a story to us, and we would sit there and we would be totally mesmerized by the reading of the story. That's what John wants us to do. It requires imagination to understand the book of Revelation. You've got to go where the author takes you.
I love it. Yep. It's brilliant. And the next chapter, I believe, is, I think, one of the most brilliant, just simple ways of understanding the book of Revelation. As you're heading into it, your idea of basically Revelation kind of needs a playbill of the characters of the book of Revelation. Otherwise, you're going to have just zero chance of understanding it. So can you describe that idea, like bring our listeners into that world? What's a playbill for Revelation, and why is that helpful?
Chris and I went to Hamilton. You'll be back, King George said.
So good.
It was so good. We loved it. Just couldn't believe how good it was. Mm-hmm. But when we get there, they give you this little thing. It's called a playbill, and you open it up and you see the actors and where they're from and everything else like that. One of the actors in Hamilton was the son of a brother of one of my students from the Bahamas. It was pretty cool. So I got to text with him and write to him. But it introduces the basic characters so that when they start appearing on the scene, you know a little bit about who they are and what they do. Mm-hmm. And where they've performed. So there's a little bit of biography there. Well, I was reading Dave Matthewson's book on the book of Revelation, and he went through, I believe, the characters. And I don't know if he used the word drama. I haven't looked at the book in a little while. And it was at that point that I thought, this is a playbill. We need to, and I don't believe I put this on when I was summarizing Dave's book on my Substack or wherever it was at the time, CT. I don't believe I called it a playbill, but I knew at that point that that's the way I wanted to describe it if I ever wrote about it. And so I actually envisioned a little bit better artwork for this, to be yellow or something like that. But they don't want to put color. But Zondervan did a nice job of putting these into columns so that it gives the impression of a playbill that you would get at a theater. Mm-hmm. And the book of Revelation is filled with, and this is characteristic of John as a writer, whether you think he wrote all the books or not, doesn't matter to me at this point. But John, the Gospel of John, light and darkness, First John, you either love God or you hate God. John likes almost like dualistic thinking. It's either this or that. It's dichotomous. You either choose team dragon or you choose team lamb, and that's the way it is. You have to make your choice. And that's the characteristic of the book. So I listed out the characters. This is really kind of fun, reading the book of Revelation, saying who's on team dragon, who's on team lamb. And it's not hard to figure them out. Babylon, the dragon, the wild thing. I translate the beast as wild thing. The Greek word therion means a wild animal, one from the sea and one from the land or the earth. And then 666, that's Nero, and others that come up in the book are on Team Dragon or Jezebel, Nicolaus, Balaam, all the sinners in the world who line up in the Battle of Armageddon. And then the Team Lamb has God on the throne. It's a Trinitarian thinking, but not quite Trinitarian language. God on the throne, the seven spirits, which is the Holy Spirit, the Lamb, which is the Son, then a legion witnesses, the woman, which is one of the most important images in the entire book of Revelation, because she corresponds to Babylon in chapters 17 through 19. The angels, the 24 elders, the four living things, myriads of people, and the New Jerusalem. So there's Babylon, there's New Jerusalem, there's the woman of Revelation 12, there's the woman of Revelation 17 and 18. So it's just, as Randy Harris said, God's team wins. Choose your team. Don't be stupid. And that's sort of the book of Revelation in a nutshell. 3 lines.
There's this famous, in the first, the actual chapters of Revelation that are preached in churches are only the first 2 chapters of the book of Revelation, unfortunately, right? The letters to the churches are the easy thing to preach and to not get controversial about. And there's this famous bit where Jesus is addressing the church in Laodicea, I believe. And he says, "You're neither hot nor cold. You're lukewarm, and I want to spit you out of my mouth." And you say that's a very, very mistranslated idea of what Jesus is trying to get across there, or the original language. Can you tell us what's a better reading, and why is that a mistranslation?
Cody may have worked on some of that stuff, but the Lycus River, which runs by Colossae, which you can still see, it's a stream just outside the tell of Colossae, is cold, fresh, brilliant water. The students that I take there will put their feet in it and just can't believe how cold it is. Well, then you go up to Hierapolis, and Hierapolis is filled with these mineral deposits. You can see Hierapolis from miles away. It's almost like Hollywood with all these white lines on the wall, on the hills. And that's warm water with all these mineral deposits. And people are up there, are in their skivvies, in their bikinis, and what do men wear that are short? Speedos. Yeah. A lot of them, the Russians love to go to Turkey for vacation, and they come up on bus trips, and they all go to this Laodicea, and all the Christians are there to see the sights, and the Russians are there to dip in the water. Laodicea is right there in the middle, and the waters come from both places, and the water is neither the cold water that's refreshing nor the warm water that's healing. So the water will do neither of these things. And that's John's image, that he says, it's not good for healing, and it's not good for slaking our thirst. It's useless. What's it for? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the category that we have in the book. I haven't looked at that for a while, and it's not anything that I've lectured on.
Okay.
So I think that's what we cover.
Well, it's just a good little bonus for pastors who are tempted to
Yeah.
preach that message. Check in with Scott's book, Revelation for the rest of us, because it's important.
So I remember when my dad sort of converted to Christianity, he got very into dispensationalism because that was in the Bible that he was given when he was a convert. It was a Schofield Study Bible. It was on the the radio preachers he was listening to and whatever. And we were attending at the time a denomination that's actually fairly liberal. And so I remember my pastor at that church saying something very much along the lines of what you said a few moments ago, which is that the point of Revelation essentially is that Jesus wins. And my dad was very bothered by that. And I think what bothered him about it, and it was one of the things I think that ended up pushing him into like Southern Baptist denomination. And I think what bothered him most about it was that it wasn't like specifically vengeful enough about the people in the world that he thought were really screwing things up, particularly Bill Clinton at the time. And so what I want to ask you is, can you talk a little bit about the role of militarism and vengeance and justified violence in interpretations of Revelation, and where you think they go wrong? Like how do we understand the seemingly blood-soaked portions of that book, if not that specific vengeance way?
Well, Kyle, you're right. You've touched a very sensitive spot, and it's a sensitive one for me as well. If you read Chronicles of Narnia, there's some battle scenes there that are okay. You read them, the good guys win and the bad guys lose. It's okay. You read the Iliad, and it's a little bit gory, but it's okay because it's fiction. It's supposedly it is fiction, but some people think it happened all as described. But the Book of Revelation chooses to be an apocalypse. And it chooses cosmic language of a battle between God and the dragon. So we have sort of cosmic figures in a cosmic battle, turning the whole world into a cosmic battlefield. This, as fiction, I don't think we should be as bothered by the imagery as we would be if we actually thought this is what is going to happen on planet Earth. So the biggest problem for the violence in the Book of Revelation, I'm not saying it's not a problem anyway, but the biggest problem for the violence in the Book of Revelation is that we read it literally. And some of the critics of dispensationalism, who sort of ridicule their literal interpretation, when they turn into criticizing what the Bible says, like Bart Ehrman, they suddenly think that literal reading is the only way to see it, and therefore all these bodies are going to be in the valley of Armageddon, or in Armageddon. That's a part of the valley of Megiddo. There's going to be blood up to the shoulder, up to the mouths, the bridles of the horses. Well, if you've ever been there, there are enough valleys coming out of it that the blood's going to leak, and it's not going to get that high. It's impossible. But that's the point. The point is, this is fiction, and it is describing victory over evil. And so this helps me with the gory scenes, but at the same time, it is connected to God in the Book of Revelation. And so I have a generous interpretation of the Book of Revelation as a first century document that the minute the author chose to use apocalyptic language, he put himself into a position of using language like this. If John had chosen a letter, he would never have used this kind of violence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
He chose instead this kind of cosmic battlefield. And when you do that, you got to have a winner and a loser. And in the first century, you're going to describe losers in pretty gruesome scenes.
And perhaps when you're an oppressed people group, you feel like you're at war almost.
Yeah. In fact, I had a student who was a pastor in Yugoslavia before breakdowns of these sorts of socialist communist countries, pastored 27 churches. very small churches. And he traveled, and he was always getting put into police stations and asked questions. And I asked him in class one day, what's the favorite book in the New Testament for your Christians, for your people? And he said, the book of Revelation. I said, why? He says, because God's people win.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found that oppressed people love the book of Revelation, not because they like violence, but because they like justice being established. And if it's okay for those kinds of people to describe difficult, bloody scenes, especially in the first century, because they know that it symbolizes that God is going to win. They like that.
Yeah.
Only the privileged people of white suburban life are the ones who get a little nervous about this kind of language. The people who are oppressed want to see justice established.
Yes.
So one of the things I appreciated that you said in the book is that framing, it's about the millennium, right? And so you often hear the framing of, are you a premillennial or a postmillennial or an amillennial or whatever? And you make the point that framing it that way, and even if someone takes the position of amillennialism, it makes it seem like kind of a response to one of those other ones rather than the majority position of most interpreters in history, right? And that's kind of a problematic framing from the beginning, because it still centers the millennium, and you think that's an interpretive error. So can you explain that? What role should the millennium play in interpretations, and why do you think it should be minimized more than it is typically?
Okay, this is that's right. Is that to call someone a millennial is to say you don't have a millennium. Well, that's the point. There is no millennium for those people. But I saw that someone else calls it realized millennium, that it's alive. Okay, here's I don't believe the way evangelicals, dispensationalists, premillennialists talk about the millennium. I don't believe that's accurate at all. Okay, and here's why. The book of Revelation has one section on the millennium, and it is for martyrs and martyrs alone. And they've had to translate martyrs into all believers. And that's just wrong, okay? And what is described in Revelation 20 is not in what people talk about the millennium, which is an earthly kingdom, all right? Here's the other problem. Everything they talk about in the millennium, in the dispensational and these other schemes, pre-millennial schemes, is not in Revelation 20. So what most people believe about the millennium has nothing to do with what the Bible actually says about the millennium. And what the Bible says about the millennium has nothing to do with what those people are talking about. So I think it's wrong. And Richard Bauckham basically says this. I don't know what, basically, I think it's fair to say, I don't know what to do with this when it comes to chronology. It doesn't fit anything else that I know how to make sense of in the book of Revelation. I think that's pretty wise by one of the greatest scholars in the history of the church on the book of Revelation, Richard Bauckham. Mm-hmm. But it's for martyrs. It's for those who were put to death because they bore witness to the Lamb of God.
Mm-hmm. Scott, just a quick break. It's 8:25. How much more time do you have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. All right.
All right.
I'll try to stay awake.
All right. Oh, shoot. I can ask one question. Okay. I want to ask you, okay, here's my 1.5. Is Revelation a bit of a theodicy? We talk about theodicy and the problem, trying to solve the problem of evil. Would you say in any way, shape, or form it's a theodicy?
Yes.
Okay. Good enough, right there. Real question, though. So in the end of the book, you talk about Christian nationalism. And I don't think we have many Christian nationalists, if any, listening to the podcast. If we do, welcome. I'm glad you're here. But we do have a lot of people who maybe think and are in some way, shape, or form patriotic. Love this country, love America. We have listeners abroad, but mostly in America. And as I studied for a sermon series I did a couple of years ago and studied, Michael Gorman and Richard Bauckham, it got at my idea of patriotism so deeply that, for example, I can't bring myself to say the Pledge of Allegiance anymore since I studied the book of Revelation, because I think that Jesus, the Lamb, is calling for all of my allegiance. and I don't want to pledge something to a nation of this country, of this world. How do you reconcile patriotism in the Book of Revelation?
Well, you've touched something that really reflects the heartbeat of this book. It is about allegiance to Jesus as the Lamb. I would say patriotism is different than Christian nationalism, and I would say patriotism is someone who is, let's just say, a good citizen of the country in which they live. Okay. And that's entirely fine. But John did not know that world. This is not the world of John. I mean, Paul knows it in Romans 13. If he'd have written that letter 4 years later when Nero started going nutty, he wouldn't have said that. Peter, in 1 Peter 2, verses 11 to 12, and then 13 to 17, he knows a slightly different strategy. The world is tough, but we have to try to do good. The pastoral epistles are arguing for people to have civilized piety, a respectable religion to practice in such a way that they don't hurt the church. But the book of Revelation has a completely different angle, that the Roman Empire, Babylon, is corrupt. It's very negative. It's almost cynical. These people are so corrupt, they're starting to creep into our church. We need to resist them. That's the message of Revelation. It teaches us that patriotism has a limit.
Yes.
You can be a good citizen, but you should never surrender. Okay, you should never give to Caesar what is God's. Now that's a coin from Jesus. It's slightly different, but that's the point. As I think Jesus is calling people to follow him in spite of the opposition to the gospel and to the people of God, and that in that situation, absolute allegiance is absolutely necessary. In a different context where it's okay to be a Christian, I think patriotism has a slightly different sense.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Most important question of the night: why does every television show and movie get it wrong and say Revelations instead of Revelation? Where the heck does that come from?
Well, there are revelations in the book, aren't there? Yeah. But the interesting thing is, when John uses that word, it's a revelation of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So it's not really, it's not all these visions that are called revelations. So, but yeah, I've heard it my whole life. And I don't even correct my students when they say it now. I used to correct college students, but my seminary students who say revelations, I just go, okay. I hope someone in the class heard that and says, it's not revelations, it's revelation. But yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, the book, again, is Revelation for the rest of us. And it's a must read if you're not familiar with Revelation, if you're scared of Revelation, you've been traumatized by the way it's been delivered, or if you're a pastor and you've never preached a sermon series on the book of Revelation, you must get this book by Scot McKnight and read it and then do a sermon series on it, because Revelation might just be the book that can save the American church if we took it seriously.
There's a lot of truth in that. You know, in John's Revelation, he thinks there's two primary, other than discernment of Babylon, he thinks people have to be witnesses to Jesus and worship. And I would say this, the biggest problem for Christians who are so entangled in the political process in the United States and have become drunk in an adulterous way with Babylon in our world today is they don't worship. Yeah. The more we worship the Lamb, the less we are attracted to Babylon. The more time we spend in New Jerusalem, the more we can discern Babylon.
Yes. Brilliant. Mic drop right there. Scot McKnight, thank you so much for being a friend of the podcast and journeying with us. We appreciate you. We'll look forward to maybe talking to you after your new translation comes out.
That'd be fun.
Really hard to read.
Yeah. Hey, Kyle and Randy, thank you for having me. It's good to see you again.
Yeah.
All right.
So one of the things I appreciated in the book, I'm going to wait until Randy's phone stops going off so I can ask this question.
Computer, sorry. I'm that guy.
In my classes, if a phone goes off, You have three choices. You get to let me answer the phone,
Yes.
or you have to stand up and sing a song, or you have to buy donuts for the class the next time.
What do
That's
they
good
what do they
rules.
choose usually? Those are all great options.
They usually choose donuts because when I did this at North Park, the students they would just start calling one another and get someone's phone to ring. And I don't have the money when you buy donuts, so I would buy donuts for them.
Nice, nice.